The objective of this video is what are asset agreements? Asset agreements are an agreement between you and your customer where the customer does not pay rent for certain kinds of assets for a given amount of time. There are many different kinds of these agreements. We generically in TrackAbout call them all asset agreements, but some common examples would be leases, deposits, prepaid rent, and customer-owned offsets. All of these are different kinds of agreements structured slightly differently that mean the customer does not have to pay rent for a certain amount of time, maybe indefinitely. What's different among these, like what makes leases different than deposits or different than customer-owned offsets or prepaid rent, are these different properties we have of the kinds of asset agreements. So they each have a name, like deposit or lease. They have a description, just for your own internal people, of what this roughly means. Does it have a price? So for example, a lease or a cylinder deposit typically has some kind of a price, whereas a customer-owned offset, that's usually an agreement where the customer gives you an asset, one of their own assets, and in return you don't charge them rent for that kind of asset in the future. There is no price because they gave you an asset instead of giving you money. Does it have an end date? So for example, leases typically have end dates, 12 months, 60 months, 120 months, something like that, whereas a deposit typically has no end date. It just goes on forever. The customer paid a deposit, basically bought the asset, and they don't have to pay rent on it in the future. For the ones that do have an end date, they can have a minimum duration, a maximum duration, and a default duration. So you might say all my leases have to be between 12 and 60 months. Alternatively, you can make one kind of agreement called a 12-month lease. That's minimum, maximum, and default are all 12 months. So when somebody creates a 12-month lease, it has to be exactly 12 months. Or it could be more of a range where people could pick a number within that range. And lastly, what makes them different is when they're shown on the rental bill, does the quantity for this agreement show up in the owned column or a column called leased? So something like a customer-owned offset would show up in an owned column, whereas leases would show up in a lease column. So that's just a quick snapshot of the different kinds of asset agreements. Again, regardless of what they're normally called, a lease or prepaid rent, they're all called asset agreements in TrackAbout, and they all stop a customer from paying rent for a certain amount of time.